Well, I have to tell you, the most important thing to me personally is when I hear someone else tell me that I don't have a big ego. I mean, that's really important to me.
Well played.
That's an ego joke right there.
I
guys.
get it. Yeah.
We need a rim shot sound.
Yeah.
Right.
Wah, 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 wah. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us for another edition of Lead.exe. We've got all sorts of information we're going to send your way that is chock full of goodness to help you hack the leadership code. Kick it off, John.
Sure. Thanks, guys. How's everybody doing today?
Delightful.
I'm doing good, man. We're pumped for season 4, right? We've got a lot of great stuff coming up, and this is kind of going to be episode 1 of season 4, I think, unless you guys think differently.
No, it sounds good.
Hey, let's
to me.
take it. Episode 1.
So I think we talked a little bit about a topic for today, which I think is good for a kickoff episode of a new season as we continue to iterate on the podcast and hopefully make it better and better as we go. I'm not sure if my recent addition to the cast is helping in that regard, but I'll do my best. But
John,
the idea,
you got to get more. You got to get more buzzwordy instead of iterate. You got to go ideate, right? You got to do the design thinking thing, right? That's
synergy
right now. So we need to just
ideate,
throw multiple
ideate,
ideas.
ideate.
Yeah, see, and we got to do that, right? We need to.
Well, we'll do that with our next sprint on the Kanban.
We need to make it actionable. Actionable.
Okay. Well, we're definitely not more effective than we were last year, but okay.
Okay. Season 4 is off to a great start.
Yeah. So so welcome to season 5. We're just going to throw out season 4 and go right to the season 4 kickoff. I thought it would be nice to talk about a concept that's repeated by a number of people. I read it most recently from an author I'm prone to quoting, Stephen Covey from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. The principle that private victories precede public victories. So this concept of learning to lead ourselves before we can lead others, and continuing to lead ourselves as we go through our leadership journey. So I thought that'd be a good thing to talk about, and maybe one way to talk or to kick this conversation off rather would be hearing from each of you guys. What are some ways that you lead yourself, and how do you think that makes you a better leader for the teams that you're put in charge of? I'll go to Brian first because he's nodding profusely.
It's just because I'm nervous, John. You put me on the spot. I'm uncomfortable like that.
You guys have the same haircut, so you just gotta sticking with the guy with the same haircut, right?
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not really sure who I'm looking at when I'm looking at the video.
It'd really mess you up if I grew a goatee.
There you go.
So
I want to see you grow a goatee now.
Oh dear, I can't do it because my wife says it makes me look evil.
No comments?
Well, now that we've had that sidebar, go ahead, Brian, and
right.
answer John's question there.
Yeah. So areas that I sort of try to strive in, for my own personal growth. I mean, I'm always working on something. In fact, I tend to rotate out books. I tend to go from something that's fiction to nonfiction to personal growth. And, sometimes that may be a leadership book. Sometimes it may be a, self-help book, whatever it is. All of those things that can help elevate my own self-awareness. That's kind of critical to who I am. But something I think you both know about me, I'm also a daily meditator, right? So that's been something that's been in my practice, not 100% consistently, but for about 30 years, it's something that I've done, routinely. And I do believe that meditation, it has a lot of benefits that sort of transcend what I think a lot of people sort of perceive about it. That it's some kind of spiritual practice. That could be true. For me, it's more a practice of getting clear, right? Having mental clarity. I used to do a little exercise for about 5 minutes before I'd even go into a meeting, especially if I was a presenter, just so that I could, get my heart rate down, have a really steady rhythm of breathing, and actually not even think about anything. So part of the practice of meditation is, not actually having any necessary thought that is a central focus to what you're doing. It's just counting your breaths. Now, that can be different if you've got something like a mantra and that's the thing that you're focusing on. But the point is to not focus on the constant mental chatter that tends to be always going on in the background of all of our minds. And I tried explaining it to a friend of mine who asked me, what's the benefit of meditation? And I told him, if you took a glass of water and you sprinkled a little bit of salt into it, and then you stirred up that glass of water, that's like your mind just as it sort of always is, right? You're always on, you've always got, ideas and thoughts and, things that are on your mental to-do list that are constantly swirling around. And each one of those things grabs your attention, right? Even if it's only temporarily. What meditation for me does is it allows that stirring to stop and everything to settle. And even if it's just briefly, then it opens the door for some mental clarity so that when you do go into something like a meeting or a presentation that you have to lead, you're in a calm state, right? You're not all scrambled up with these things that could be distracting to you, but can also take away from your ability to communicate clearly and effectively. So reducing noise, and that would be one of the pillars that you would tie it to, right?
Yeah. I would say you did a little increase of clarity there as well. So I want to dig into that a little bit. I think this is a good topic, and then we'll put Nick on the spot. Nick better have a really good answer because he's had time to think about it now. So Brian, it sounds like establishing some sort of a regular meditation practice for you, you might put that in the bucket of a private victory, right? That's something that you do on your own, personal growth. It helps you. What sorts of public victories do you think that's translated into for you, or that you can tie back to that private work that you do?
Yeah, one area. So let me comment first on part of what you just said there, John. So, I view it for my own routine the same way that I view regular exercise, right? So, actually, making sure that you carve out a little bit of time, even if it's just 10 minutes a day, or even if it's 5 minutes late in the afternoon after you're done with meetings for the day, or whatever it is, just having that consistency where it's part of, your routine. To me, having that mental exercise is as important as physical exercise. So how that translates into some of the public victories. So for example, I've led a lot of teams, and typically, you're going into a one-on-one. The way that I've always structured the one-on-ones with my direct reports is it's their meeting, right? It's not my meeting, it's their time with me. And so my request to them is to prepare the agenda and come to me. And sometimes what that means is that, I've got to be mentally prepared to be responsive. And that starts with some active listening. So I can't just be sitting there, having in mind the next thing that I want to jump onto, to say in response to a comment that someone's making to me. I really need to listen to understand, where are they coming from? Kind of what's their emotional state? Is there a psychological attribute attached to, kind of what they're experiencing on a behavioral level? Where is the real challenge, especially if they're having a hard time identifying it? Sometimes a direct report comes to you and they know they're having problems and they don't really know how to identify specifically where the challenge is. And so from a leadership perspective, I think it's important to have the mental clarity to listen and to apprehend that information in a way that you can then meaningfully respond.
Mm-hmm. That's great. That's a good answer. And I think, you alluded to the reduce noise piece earlier, and, I've gone over the foundational things that I have for my management / communication style before, but increase clarity, reduce noise, build trust, and save people time. I've been kicking around lately that reduce noise maybe should come first. Increase clarity, reduce noise maybe flows off the tongue a little bit better, but reduce noise, increase clarity. I think if you think of them as building blocks on one another, it sounds like you're taking that time to reduce the noise in your own head or in your own life. Allows you to go into a conversation with a one-on-one or before a presentation, not only with that sense of clarity of what you're trying to accomplish, but to even perhaps provide some of that clarity for the person with whom you're communicating or leading. That, of course, builds trust and ultimately saves time. So I think that's a great example of internal work, private victories turning into public victories. That's a really good example. Thanks, Brian. All right, Nick.
Yeah. Hey, can I just follow on one
sure,
point
please.
with that, John? Because I do like how you sort of encapsulated that. No, it's okay. It just occurred to me as you were saying that. I think for me, part of the effectiveness of what that technique means for me is that I recognize the absence of it pretty dramatically, right? Like if I don't have that time, I notice that it's kind of like a bump in the road for my day. You know what I mean? And I remember, studying a lot of different techniques. It wasn't until I read, it was actually a biography about the Beach Boys and Mike Love, right? The lead singer for the Beach Boys. He talked about studying transcendental meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and that one of the techniques that Maharishi taught him was you really don't need much time for this. Actually, what you need is you just need enough time to count to 10. And so what that can mean is you might be in an office and you've got a call. And so if you can just straighten up your back and sit in a good posture, put your hands on your knees, close your eyes, breathe in, count 1, breathe out, count 2, and get up to 10. That's all the time it really takes, right? To just create sort of that biorhythmic feedback for yourself that helps like steady your heart rhythm, get yourself to a place of mental clarity, and help you personally be more effective. Thank you for letting me share that.
That's great. And, I think, another Stephen Covey thing, I think it's him, is one of the things that makes us uniquely human. He talks about the word responsibility, and he breaks it into two things, the ability to respond. And one of the things that makes us uniquely human is that we, unlike a lot of animals, have the clarity of mind or the ability to put a gap between that stimulus and response, right? So A happens, B, I have the ability to respond in a way that I want, as opposed to just fight or flight like a deer in the woods might, So I think what you've talked about details that pretty well, giving yourself that space to respond appropriately to a given situation or stimulus. So really awesome stuff. Thanks.
Respond
Nick?
versus react.
Yeah, for sure. Exactly.
How am I supposed to follow that up? It's I mean, Brian just had a whole monologue there on a ton of stuff. I agree. But when I go back to your thing and you asked your initial question, I instantly thought of that Jordan Peterson book, The 12 Rules for Life. And I believe it's that book. He has a rule in there. It's one of the early ones, too. It's like you should take care of yourself like you're someone who you're responsible for. And I'm probably butchering that rule, but it's basically like you should take care of yourself like you would if you were responsible for somebody else. Because a lot of times, and I know me included, sometimes in the past I had been stuck in, not taking care of myself, putting other people first. And sometimes you have to do, like Brian said, is you've got to work from the inside first and take care of yourself first. And for me, it's always been, like physical fitness, right? I need to work out in the morning. I have to go do our martial art. There's something about being able to focus on yourself internally and be in those moments when you don't have to think really. You're just reacting to what's going on. Allows you to have some kind of mental clarity and some space where you can kind of get stuff off your chest. And especially for me, and I don't know if this is like for you, John, but for the martial arts side, having that other outlet where you go somewhere else, you interact with other human beings, and half the time we don't even know what anybody else does, right? We're just all collectively together in this moment doing one of the same thing. And there's something gratifying about that, being able to just kind of, release any energy and just kind of be there in the moment. And I feel like having things like that as a leader allows you the opportunity to come into situations with more of a clear head, right? You're not panicking right away as soon as you hear the news of something terrible going on, right? You're just ready to react because you've kind of put yourself in those situations. So I would agree with everything Brian said, and I was never a huge fan initially of meditation until I started talking more with Brian and find out there's different things that can be considered meditation. So for me, like I used to do triathlon a lot, and I would consider swimming the same thing, right? Swimming is one of those things when especially if you do, the freestyle or front crawl, they call it other places, is like you have your head in the water. You can't have headphones. You're just looking down at the pool and looking at the side and looking down, and you just kind of hear the water and you hit the waves, and it just allows you to have that moment of clarity and peace where we're not kind of inundated as much as we are today. We have phones, and our phones are buzzing at us, our emails dinging. I don't know about you guys. I can get a phone call, and my phone rings, my computer rings, and like an iPad rings, and then another computer rings. So instantly, I can be inundated, and I find having that release, that quiet time, that peaceful time, allows me to come into different situations with more clarity and more peace at mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's all good stuff, and I think the martial arts example is a good one and a nice segue into kind of where I wanted to sort of take this conversation. Of course, I'm happy for it to go any direction because this is a fun exploration here. But martial arts is a good example of the private victory being drill after drill after drill after drill, and writing in your notebook, we trained to this today, and watching videos and doing all those things. If we use this as a metaphor for performance at work or just general leadership, before you get to the tournament, right? You can't, I think the way Covey puts it is you can't harvest a crop you didn't plant. So what are these things? But the training isn't the fun part necessarily. Doing the drills over and over and over again isn't the fun part. Sitting down and meditating, especially at first when you're new to it, or even later on, I've been a meditator for a while as well. It's not always fun. Sometimes it really sucks. Like you're sitting there, your mind keeps wandering, you're bored, all these things. But it's learning to get over those things. And, nobody gets an award, and nobody gets praise, and people don't sit down and just watch you meditate because it's so great. But that victory of doing that and having that self-control, facilitates your ability to perform in other aspects of your life. And that's when you might get the accolades or be recognized for great performance. But all the same, going back to martial arts, that's not the goal. The goal is continual growth. The goal isn't to get a trophy or to, get a round of applause after your presentation at work, necessarily. Those are great things. But when it comes to private victories preceding public victories, the goal is really your own personal self-improvement. And then the other piece I wanted to add, we've talked about response versus reaction. Nick, I think you had a good point that giving yourself that space and that mental clarity so that you can react and you don't always have to think about it. I think that's a great example of putting in the work and the drilling to keep going with this martial arts metaphor. The first time you go to jiu-jitsu, right, and somebody gets you in the mount, you freeze. What do I do, right? Then that happens over and over and over again, and you start to realize, okay, well, here's the right response. And then there's this phase where you know what the right thing to do is, but your body doesn't quite catch up. And then after you do it long enough, you're doing things before you even have to think about it, and they're the right things to do. So it's an interesting progression from that aspect.
Yeah, and I would add something on to that, just because I know we've talked about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu a lot, but you could also just put this, think just us as humans in general. And I have, and I'm sure you guys have, I've gone to go do something with a group of people, signed up for something, and then kind of backed out at the last minute, gave myself some reason why I couldn't do it, right? Maybe I got myself all the way to the door and I was like, you know what, I'm just not going to do it today. And it's that, putting yourself in uncomfortable situations and getting experience with doing that, whether it's martial arts or it's running a marathon or, practicing meditating, can help carry over into your professional life and your leadership life, right? As we get more experience with embracing the suck, as you guys say in the Marine Corps, right, John? Embrace the suck, right? As you get more into that and you get more comfortable with uncertainty and pressure, the easier you can react when those situations actually happen, which I find gives me more clarity later on when I'm put in that physical situation. I'm not the person who's freaking out like when a whole network goes down. It's like, okay, well, what's their greatest need here right now? We got to do A, B, C, and D before we can do anything else. It's giving our space that opportunity to react, right? And that's where, we're talking about those uncomfortable situations. And you getting used to them, you do that on a personal level, but then can also help you in that leadership, that public level too, with your employees, right? If they see you not freaking out when the whole network's down, the whole architecture's, blowing up and people are emailing saying they can't get stuff, and they just see you sitting there calm, I feel like it's a calming factor for other people too. It's like, hey, he's not freaking out, so like we don't need to freak out. We'll get this done. We'll get through it. So that's just all I wanted to add onto that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. A good but haunting metaphor. Yeah. You just want to just make sure you're not the one rearranging the deck chairs, right?
Yes. Yeah. I agree with Nick on that. I think it's important actually to have, that sort of deliberate calm, especially, in the midst of crisis. And it is a difficult thing to maintain. Because you do have a lot of things coming your direction, particularly in technology leadership. When you're dealing with something like an outage, there's nothing worse, especially when you get the hairy eyeball from the CFO who's telling you you're losing $100,000 an hour, with your downtime. It's more than an inconvenience. It's a genuine business impact, right? So that's a form of meditation in and of itself.
Indeed. So I want to take this in a little bit of a different direction then, and talk about ego. So I think that's a natural thing with meditation. It really makes you think about yourself. Sometimes you get some uncomfortable thoughts about that thing you did or you said or the way you're acting, or something that happened to you maybe in the past. So what are your thoughts on private victories versus public victories in terms of ego? And I want to go a little bit further on that in terms of, your motivation for doing a given thing. Do I want to be the calm guy playing the music as the Titanic's sinking because I want to feel big and cool and be the go-to person about it? Or is it because it's the right thing to do? And how do some private victories that you've had in your lives maybe inform that question or inform the answer to that question?
Well, I have to tell you, the most important thing to me personally is when I hear someone else tell me that I don't have a big ego. I mean, that's really important to me.
Well played.
That's an ego joke right there.
I
guys.
get it. Yeah.
we need a rim shot sound.
Yeah.
Right.
Wah, 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 wah. Yeah.
Well, I think sort of the inverse of what you just asked is, where do you operate from a space of humility? And that is a leadership characteristic that has always been one I've respected. In particular, as I've worked with other leaders that I've had to collaborate with very closely, and sometimes you get someone who, for whatever reason, they cannot operate from a place of humility. And they've got to, make sure that sort of they're constantly thumbing you down on any variety of things, right? But when you work with someone who you can tell is truly talented, truly experienced, truly knowledgeable, and they don't need to rub it in your face. They're just operating in the same space that you are, so that they can contribute to whatever is necessary to help resolve the issue or contribute some thought leadership or whatever it is. That's when it's easy to be able to identify humility. It's sort of in the absence of the standard ego practices. And I think humility comes with a lot of self-awareness. So as you continue to try to develop those things internally, and for lack of a better term, have like a no asshole rule with yourself, right? You start to identify those things where it's like, actually the way that I said that, or the way that I behaved, that could be interpreted, pretty negatively by other people. And I don't want to have that kind of interpretation with my own behavior. That kind of self-awareness then starts to drive who you choose to represent yourself as. And when I say that, I don't mean you're creating a false front. It's actually the opposite. It's driving more into the authenticity of what it is that you can contribute to something. Because, the false front is often where we get the, oh yeah, I can do that too. Or, oh, did you know how important this thing is that I did? And that's where a lot of the, sort of lizard brain jumps in because it needs that animalistic, competitive feedback to feel satisfied.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer. And you were mentioning earlier, when you're working with a true professional or somebody who's truly talented, et cetera. I would add that in the terms of a private victory, it's also when you're working with somebody who's truly understands that they're not talented in a particular thing, or that they don't have the experience in the particular thing, and they're willing to learn. And that's a private victory in and of itself. And that's a vulnerable position to be in. If Brian, you hire me, or Nick, you hire me for a job, and I don't quite know how to do a particular thing, I can fake it for a while, right? Or if I faked it in the interview, this job requires the ability to speak Spanish. Yeah, sure, I can do that. First call with our international client, and I can, it's going to come up really quickly. And that's an obvious example, right? But there are micro examples of that all the time. Hey, do you know how to handle this task, whatever, on the team? How to send this particular alert? Sure. Yeah, I know how to do that. And then, oh wait, I really don't. Do you have the humility to ask and to say that I don't know? And maybe that's a public defeat. Maybe that's not a victory. But the private victory is having the humility to ask and learn, so that you can have that public victory later. So I thought that was an interesting takeaway from what you were talking about, Brian.
Yeah, I think from a leadership perspective, it's important to, be, very upfront about the fact that you don't know everything. And part of the reason that you've assembled the team that you have the leadership capabilities to make that team effective. You might not necessarily have the leadership capabilities to know exactly how each of the individual roles is going to get their job done. And you're going to have to be reliant on them to help skill you up so that you can effectively deliver a message, further up the chain or whatever it is.
I think I'd argue without the private victory to do that kind of personal growth and have that comfort in saying, I don't know, you'll never you'll at minimum, or at best rather, you'll kind of Peter Principle out, right? You might rise to the level of your own incompetence, but then you're just going to be swimming in the deep blue sea and not really have a life raft for you. So we'll keep going with the Titanic metaphor. So that's all important stuff. Nick, it seemed like you had a thought and I kind of cut you off, so I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. The only thing I want to touch on is I feel like the word ego gets a bad rap, right? Because when you think about it from a psychology term, ego just means self, right? So when we talk about having a big ego, you're normally talking about a certain personality type, right? You hear different things where people are like, oh, check your ego at the door. I can't check myself at the door. Like I go somewhere, I have a personality, right? Just like Brian has one and you have one. And I think it just touches on basically what Brian was saying. It's about humility, right? And some self-awareness to go along with your ego. Your ego's there. It's always going to be there. It's a part of who you are. And that's all I wanted to add to that conversation.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, ego is critical, and, ego is critical. You think of someone like, General Patton. Part of what made him an effective leader was that he had this towering presence, and that ego is representative of all of those internal things within his personality that gave him that kind of magnetism, right? Ego is absolutely necessary. It's the unbridled ego, the type A personality, and you heard me reference it earlier, the lizard brain, right? It's the reptilian self that is just truly zero-sum game, competitiveness. That's the portion of the ego that tends to get people into trouble. And ironically, I think the most frequently you see that give rise is when you've got someone that's got very deep-seated insecurities. And so that it's the manifestation of ego in that way that is really, truly putting the false front out there so that they can seem more sophisticated, more powerful, more important than they necessarily feel that they are themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll share a story on that topic. I once worked, I won't name names or offices, but I once worked in a place with a gentleman who had some serious emotional intelligence issues and was constantly irritating people. He's a relatively highly paid, experienced person, retired military officer, and it got to the point where the leader of that particular team arranged emotional intelligence training for the entire team, partly to help kind of save this one individual's ego. They didn't want to single him out. And this person had the gall to say, well, I'm already very emotionally intelligent, so I don't need this. And just that statement alone, right? Not to mention the fact that the entire training was for this person, right? It says a lot. So this person clearly hadn't done the internal work. There was probably, this is an intelligent person, they could probably articulate what emotional intelligence was, what leadership was. Again, they'd been a retired military officer. They knew by the book what leadership was, but that's all technique. That's all personality. It's not that deep intrinsic work that you need to do to really apply those things and those foundational building blocks. So I think that's one of the things that often gets left out in all this self-help leadership business literature, is how to just take life by the horns and go get it and this, that, the other thing. There's the other side of that coin, right? And sometimes we use these larger than life personalities like Patton or like Richard Branson or something. I don't know. Pick a bombastic type leader. And we forget two things. One is that they're not always that way. Sometimes those leaders know very well when to apply those techniques, when to be that way. And two, they're not without their faults. Who's to say that Patton, I think Patton got demoted to colonel like 3 times in his career or something like that, right? Now, maybe you could argue that bureaucratically speaking, he was still right, blah, blah, blah. There's a whole bunch of Army nerds that'll pick that all apart. But the point is, being that way isn't always the right answer. So knowing what stimulus to apply to what situation is vitally important. And again, you can't do that. You can't know those situations without doing the nitty-gritty private reflection, thinking about your own thoughts, meditating, screwing up a few times, and then genuinely asking yourself, why did I respond that way to that situation? Why did I get angry? Why did I fly off the handle? Why did I treat that person that way? Why did that person treat me that way? Is there something I did that elicited that response from somebody else? And it's difficult. It's hard to look in the mirror and do those things, and sometimes it can even be painful. But it's really, really important. So one thing I wanted to
my first response
shift
to
gears
that,
a little
John,
bit. I think. Oh, sorry.
John,
please.
I've got a response to that. So I was going to say my first response is I didn't realize that you and I had worked at the same office before.
I think we've all worked at that office, right?
Yeah, that's right. Well, my second response is, I think the approach that you described that was taken also exhibits a degree of deficiency of leadership in and of itself. And what I mean by that is, whenever you instantiate a policy that gets applied to a group that's really intended to address the behavior of an individual, that's the wrong kind of policy to put into place. I mean, there was an opportunity for someone in a leadership role somewhere along the line to take that individual aside and say, now we're going to be given this emotional intelligence training. And I'd like you to know, my expectation is that you're going to be the first one to sign up. Because to be completely honest, you're the only one who seems to be deficient in this area, despite what you may think of yourself, right? Maybe not that heavy-handed, but that needs to be the context of the message at some stage in that kind of interaction. So just my contribution to your anecdote there.
Yeah, no, great. Very good point. I think a kind of a natural next step on this conversation, I was thinking back, this quote stuck with me for whatever reason. I think I was like 14 or 15 years old. On the high school wrestling team, we had like a joint practice with another team, and they had this big sign on their wall in their gym that true pride is that which drives us to do our very best, even when no one is looking. And I think it gets back to this idea of, doing the work, putting in the reps at the gym, if we're talking about physical fitness, or the reps in training for jiu-jitsu, or the daily meditation and the writing in your journal, or studying the books before your big sales presentation, whatever it might be, putting in those reps even when no one is looking. As I reflected on that quote, I wanted to switch out the word even with especially. I think it's what drives us to do our best, especially when nobody's looking. Because I think that marries nicely with this conversation of the ego, the negative connotation of the ego is that if you're only doing it to be seen and you're not doing it to be effective or not doing it to better yourself, ultimately you're going to get seen out or shown as a phony eventually. Or you're going to find that when the real task arrives, to what Nick was talking about earlier, when the whole IT infrastructure is crashing, you might find out you're not actually up to the task the way that you thought you were. So any thoughts on that quote?
I mean, that's a good one, right? It's about doing the little things every day. And I think that's become pretty popular lately, too, with the emergence of people like Jocko Willink and David Goggins and, reading about Steve Jobs. And I don't know if you read the Steve Jobs book that was out about a decade ago. And he's talking about working with his father, and they're whitewashing a fence. And his father says to him, we got to make sure we do the backside just as good as we do the front side. And he's like, well, why does that matter? He goes, because I know what the other side looks like. It doesn't matter that anybody else can see it. I know that it's there. And I think when you take that approach and you start looking at things that way, it starts applying to other areas of your life, right, too. And some of that might just be like your communication at work. Maybe you start becoming an over communicator because you just want to be sure that all the things that you're doing on the back end are being seen on the front end too, right? And there's other times when we do stuff like that, like you said, like journaling, right? You might journal daily and only go look back at it every now and then. But at that point in time when you're doing it, you're creating a moment of clarity for you. And something that you can help build upon later. And that's my 2 cents on that. I don't know if Brian's got a different viewpoint on it.
Yeah, that's a great example, Nick. I love that anecdote that you just shared. We touched earlier on kind of this format that I've had for my one-on-ones with direct reports, which is to always make sure that it's their meeting. One thing that I've always kind of baked into, the tail end of those meetings is an open question: how am I doing for you? And, that's a method that I employ to solicit feedback. And, when you're in a one-on-one situation, if you don't know your, direct report well, it'll make them immediately uncomfortable and say, oh no, great. Hey, everything's awesome. They'll never give you genuine feedback. And so sometimes it may take a little bit of additional prompting on your part to say something to the effect of, well, in this latest project, I know we ran into a bump, on such and such an issue. I feel like I could have jumped in sooner, or, I don't feel like I had your back the way that I should have publicly, and I wanted to check in with you. Did you feel that same way? Or, how did you make it feel? So that you can actually solicit some of that feedback and then take that and, bake it into your own elevation of self-awareness. Because, to the point of your quote there, John, every time that you're engaged in a situation, on the interior, whether or not you're operating at your peak performance. Whether or not you're in the middle of a meeting and you're just zoning out and you're like, oh my God. And someone asks you a question, you're like, oh yeah, you bet. And you're not giving it your all, you're not truly devoted to that moment in the way that you should be. So I think having any opportunity to solicit that kind of feedback from those that you work with, both above and below you, I think they're equally important opportunities.
Great. Yeah, that's awesome. I think there's some really good discussion. I enjoyed this, and I think that what might be a good way to wrap it up, unless either you have anything else you wanted to touch on before I get in a wrap-up mode. Going once, going twice. I think a neat thing, there's a book as part of my private victory, or private work rather, not that I have the victories necessarily. I like to reread the book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl every year, and it's a really well-known book, but it's about written by a psychologist who was also a concentration camp survivor during World War II. And he has this quote in his book that it can be seen that mental health is based on a certain degree of tension, the tension between what one has already achieved and what one is still ought to accomplish, or the gap between what one is and what one should become. So I apologize to Viktor Frankl for stumbling through that quote, but I really like that idea of the tension between what we are now and what we can become. And I think the only real road between those two things is working on those private victories, so that one day what we become can be that walking, talking example of a public victory. So I thought I'd leave us with that as a kind of a takeaway, hopefully thought-provoking quote. But I really enjoyed the conversation, guys. I think I learned a lot from each of you in this one, so thanks.
John, you can't just lob a Viktor Frankl bomb like that and not expect some kind of dialogue.
That's
I was trying to wrap it up for us, but go ahead. Yeah.
That's
Nick can edit out my wrapping it up. But yeah.
Yeah, no, we'll leave that in there. It's fine. It's just us, man. But that's a great book. I recommend if anyone hasn't read that one, do yourself a favor and pick it up. It's generally available. You can probably find it in your library as an audiobook too. But like you said, it's a great book, has lots of great insights, but it's also a tough read because he goes through that, his experience in a concentration camp. And one more I would add onto that too is the Gulag Archipelago, which is kind of along that lines too. And you kind of see it's a much thicker read. And that's actually an abridged edition of like 4 books, right? I think. So it's along those lines. It's a great read too. So if you enjoy the Viktor Frankl book, then you'll probably enjoy that book as well too. That's all I have to add on that one. Brian, since we're doing books, do you have one to add for that too?
Yeah, I do. But first I'll touch on the Viktor Frankl book. So, when I was about 20 years old, that book helped me through one of the darkest periods of my life. And a lot of it was because it's such a powerful story about someone who survives because they have the willingness to do so. And he spends quite a bit of time talking about the psychological characteristics of those who did not survive. It's not that they couldn't, but it's that there was a choice somewhere in there about whether or not to maintain an inner strength to push through just the most horrifying set of circumstances anyone could ever find themselves in. So I've recommended that book over and over again. In fact, I currently do not have a copy of that book, because anytime I've interacted with somebody who I know could benefit from reading it, I've always given away a copy, and then I'll hit the used bookstore and I'll get another copy. Sometimes I get 2 copies. And I've even, I've shared it with my own son when he was going through some of his own challenges, specifically related to being a competitive athlete, and kind of the mental state of fitness that he found himself in, where he would be his own worst enemy. And having read that book, then he was able to take it. And by the time his class got into World War II studies, he was already like out ahead of the group on, an understanding of, the importance of the Holocaust. So, so that, in terms of personal transformation, I think that book, it's just monumental. It's one it's very difficult to top. There is a story of personal transformation that I find really fascinating for completely different reasons, but it has a lot to do with moving someone from a space of not really having any kind of awareness of anything beyond kind of their material existence, into having a completely profound change in personality. And that's Robert A. Monroe's book, Journeys Out of the Body, where one of the founders of cable, because he was dealing with a lot of stress as a corporate executive, who did not want to take any kind of drugs that would debilitate him, like antidepressants or anything, went to see a psychologist who gave him some progressive relaxation exercises. And through the process of performing those exercises, started having these phenomenal experiences where he found his consciousness outside of his physical body. And so that very first book is written in, he's kind of an engineer by background. And so it's got a very engineering kind of approach to it, even though the topic itself might seem very new agey, but that first book doesn't come off that way at all. And it's a fascinating read. And I think it also opens up a lot of questions just about, the nature of interpersonal transformation.
Great. Well, thank you for not letting me wrap it up, because that was a lot of really good stuff, Brian. I appreciate it. That was awesome. Thanks. And I've also given that book away a number of times, the Viktor Frankl book. I tend to buy it in 2s and 3s because I know I'm going to run out of them. It's really a tremendous life-changing book. So good. Thanks.
It's probably one of the most important books of the last century,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. All right. Well, are we actually ready to wrap it up now?
We're wrapping up. So just a little bit of closing here. If you like what you're listening to, just go ahead and leave us a review on whatever podcasting platform you're listening to this on. We're pretty much everywhere. Same goes if you're watching this on YouTube, checking out the video version. Just go ahead and give us a subscribe if you like what you see. Go ahead and comment on the post. Give us a like or something. We'd like to interact with our audience more. We'd love hearing from you when we get feedback. If you're looking to connect with us, I'm Nick Lozano on LinkedIn, or I'm Ronan Janitor pretty much on every other platform. You fellows want to give where people can find you at?
Brian Comerford on LinkedIn, E23, if you really want to find out about my alter ego.
Ooh. Suspenseful.
John's interest peaked.
Well, we talked about ego a lot today. We didn't talk about the alter ego, so that's pretty good. But you can find me at John D. Abbott on LinkedIn as well.
And we're working on him with other social media platforms.
Yeah.
We got to get him on more than just LinkedIn. So we'll get him there. We'll get him there. He just got to do one more. But with that, we appreciate everybody listening, and we will catch you on the next episode.